Hey humans, how's it going? Susan Ruth here. Thanks for listening to another episode of Hey Human Podcast. This is episode 472 and my guest is Jason Prokowiew. Jason is the author of the new book War Boys, a Father and Son Memoir about his Russian father's adoption by the Nazis after they murdered his father's family. You can imagine the kind of trauma that his father dealt with and how it was passed down to his own children. And Jason and I had this conversation a few months back, but I waited until the book was available, which it is now. It's on all the book platforms as of July 1st. In other news, check out heyhumanpodcast.com for links and to learn more about my guests and the show. Check out susanruth.com to learn about me and my other artistic endeavors. You can follow Susan Ruthism on social media. Rate, review, and subscribe to Hey Human Podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And thank you for listening. Be well, be kind, stay safe, be love. Here we go. Jason Prokowiew, welcome to Hey Human.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Tell me about where you grew up and how you grew up.
Sure. So I grew up in Massachusetts in a suburb of Boston, probably about 40 minutes outside of Boston, called Sudbury, Massachusetts. I was born the youngest of 13 children. My two oldest sisters passed away when they were very young. They were born premature. But my oldest living sister, who actually now has passed away recently as well, was 22 years older than me. And yeah, I grew up with this large family, but also sort of on my own, because by the time I came along, a lot of my siblings were already out of the house, starting their own families, having their own children. You know, I always joke that I was an uncle 6 years before I was born. My oldest nephew is 6 years older than me. And it was a tough place, tough family to grow up in, because we were all sort of affected in one way or another by my actively drinking father. So I grew up in an alcoholic home. It was kind of a fear-based upbringing, a lot of trying to stay invisible in order to stay safe. That sort of shifted a bit when I turned about 10 and my dad got quite sick from his alcoholism and had cirrhosis of the liver. And after a hospitalization, he quit drinking cold turkey because he was told he would die if he had another drink. So after many decades as an active alcoholic, he was now what I and Al-anon would teach me is referred to as a dry drunk. So he wasn't actively drinking, but he still had a lot of the characteristics of an alcoholic still within him. But yeah, there was a big shift in my life from 10 onward because I didn't have an active drinker in my house anymore. Still, I think what sort of I have come to define my upbringing as, and we were all kind of like rotating around the alcoholic. We all kind of lived in response to his needs. So that was sort of been a journey since my early 20s of uncovering the effects of that upbringing, unwinding some of that tension that had built up in my life around that since I was a kid.
Did he turn his addictive personality toward any other thing? And did the violence cease when he stopped drinking?
It did, yeah. And I should say I was very, very fortunate. Of my 4 brothers, was the only one that I know of who didn't experience my father's physical violence. The way I've come to think about that is within an alcoholic system, there are certain roles that everybody plays. And I think for whatever reason, as the baby, my mother really looked to protect me and sort of drew this hard line with my father about physical violence towards me. And I also had an older sister who took on this protector role of me as well. When I speak of abuse for myself, it's largely like mental, emotional abuse. I've many times had that conversation since with therapists where I try to downplay what I experienced versus what my brothers experienced. And they do their job of saying, these are not situations to be, weighed on a scale here, Jason. Yeah. So I would say a lot of the dry drunk tendencies that I mentioned earlier were still present in sort of the emotional, mental abuse aspects until he passed away, honestly, when I was 25.
You mentioned Al-anon. How old were you when you started going to Al-anon?
I was about 21 when I first started, and I then spent six years really hardcore in the program. Learned quite a bit. Going to my first Al-anon meeting when I was about 21, and just being blown away that people were saying out loud things that I had seen my entire life, because silence was the order of the day in my family around those things. We weren't supposed to talk about them. We didn't talk about them. And suddenly I was in a room with 20 people, and many of them were talking about similar experiences.
I'm curious, with your older sister who was your protector. I had a protector as well, my big brother. Did
Mm-hmm.
Have you had conversations as an adult with her? Does she carry a guilt for or an anger now that she hasn't been? Do you know what I mean? Because that's a lot of responsibility for another kid to take on, and it creates its own complicated relationship. You talked about that as an adult, about how it wasn't her fault either, that she couldn't protect you or help you in some cases, and that it wasn't her job.
Yeah. Yeah, we have, because there was I think for me, actually, the worst part of those first 10 years when my dad was actively drinking were the years that she also went away to college. So I've expressed and written about some of those moments that my father caught me in while she was away at college. And again, it was verbal, emotional, psychological abuse. She knows about those times. And she said something like, "Oh, he still managed to get to you," about that experience and how that happened while she was at college. So she did express some guilt about that. And I told her that wasn't hers to carry. Like, she had to go to college. She had to make her escape as well, and she needed to live her life. So, as upsetting as those circumstances were for me, I don't find any blame in myself for her for going away and living her life.
Yeah. I think it's a big conversation to have that sometimes people don't talk about, is how the siblings interact with each other and what they can do moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm the only one in my family who really engaged with Al-anon as a model for healing and for moving forward. So sometimes I will speak about my experiences just within Al-anon, and it's sort of a foreign concept to them.
Does alcohol play any part in your life now?
Fortunately, not in any way that I would describe as alcoholism. I stayed completely away from any kind of drinking myself until I was about 25. I remember having like my first drink at 25 and being so nervous about it. So now I would say, like, I can enjoy a drink and it doesn't really have a connection to me with my upbringing or with alcoholism. And I can certainly see it within friends or within social settings where it does have a negative effect on people. I think, fortunately, I do not have that particular disease.
Did it have, and we can, move from this, but I just think these are important things to talk about, the culture of drinking. And, you're growing up and you're getting out there and dating and meeting people. Did you find that you had an immediate ick factor anytime somebody maybe got a little too crazy with the alcohol? Was it tricky dating? Because a lot of people use alcohol as a social lubricant.
Sure. Anecdotally, I think it wasn't alcohol, but it was somebody that I dated who was a cocaine user. And I had no idea how powerful of a drug that was. I was sort of naive to that. And I was talking to one of my good friends about my first date with this person. And he said, "Oh, I haven't done cocaine in like 2 weeks or something." And I said this to my friend, and she was like, "So we're done with him?" And I was like, "Wait, wait, why? Why are we done with him? And she's like, if he did cocaine 2 weeks ago, he does cocaine, Jason. And I was like, oh, there was a naivete to me around that stuff. So that was one of the like sort of heftier moments around addiction that I found within my dating life. I also anecdotally remember breaking up with a boyfriend in college because he smoked a lot of pot, and I just at that age between 20 to 25, I just thought any kind of drinking or drugs was just like off the table for me because of what I had been through. So I broke up with that person, and there was such a fear around all of that stuff. And like with the cocaine, there was such a lack of understanding around it. So it definitely was something that I kept in mind as I dated. I can't say beyond that those two people that I mentioned that there was ever anybody else that I really flagged it as a problem, but definitely something if I had seen it, especially around alcohol, I would have flagged it as a red flag.
I find it impressive that you had the boundaries in your early 20s to be able to have that hard line, because I think growing up in alcoholic households or any kind of mental illness household, boundaries get incredibly fuzzy, and
Yeah.
it's such a skill. So kudos to you. It sounds like the fire that you were forged in gave you the metal to be able to,
Yeah.
which is incredible, really.
Yeah, I think I appreciate that. I take that as a compliment. Thank you. I think that feels right for what was going on with me. I entered college with such an idea that I wanted to have a different life than what I had seen in my family of origin. As I often say, even now to my therapist, like I do believe I tend to gravitate towards health and healthier things. And I think even in my early 20s, I was trying to figure out how to have as many days in my life be as different than what I had grown up seeing as I could manage.
At what age did you come out to your family, or did you keep that quiet?
Yeah, I came out to my, again, huge sibling group. I came out to one of my sisters, I think, when I was 16 was the first one. And then I, not too long after that, came out to my parents. From 16, I was out to a small group of my family, and then started coming out to more people once I went to college. So even this sister that I was very close to in childhood, I can still remember coming out to her on a car ride when she was driving me up to college. So I was, 18 at the time. So it took a few years for me to start telling some of the people that I was really close to in the family. But the youngest I was 16.
I'd like to pivot for a moment to your father's childhood.
Yeah, I mean, I think I understand why my father drank. My father was born in Belarus and was about 10 years old and at summer camp in 1941 when the Nazis invaded his country. So he was at summer camp. He was 10 years old, walking in a field when a plane came out of the sky and started shooting at him. And he ran back to his cabin where he found many of the other campers and counselors hiding in their cabin. And that's how he learned that his country had just been invaded by Nazis. He and his cohort of campers and counselors walked back from camp to the capital of Belarus, Minsk, where my father lived. This whole caravan of kids and campers stood on this overlook onto the city and saw basically that it was on fire. The smoke was rising from the city, and these counselors who were really not much older than the kids that they were in charge of said to the kids, go into the city and look for your families. If they're not here, if they're not there, come back here tomorrow and we will be here waiting for you. My father, again, 10 years old, walked down into the city and found that his building had been bombed. So there was really no building to speak of. He never saw his family again. And the next day when he went back to the ridge to find the counselors, they were not there. So he was on his own from the time that he was 10 years old. So he was quite a privileged little boy up until 10 years old. My grandma was a high ranking Communist Party member. My father spoke of like these, after school palaces, as they were called, because they were members of the Pioneers, which is kind of like Boy Scouts in communist Russia. And he told me about all these like plates of just meats and fruits that they'd have every day for the kids after school. So he kind of didn't really know about survival from the age of 1 to 10 because everything was kind of provided. And then from 10 on, it was like all survival because he had to learn how to beg, to steal, anything to feed himself for the next several years, and anything to find a place to sleep and stay warm for the next several years. So that is what he did as basically an orphan in this city that was now populated and occupied by Nazis. He happened to beg at the right Nazi occupied building in Minsk. And he had been picking up some German along the way with his begging and his stealing.
He was blonde
and blue-eyed. Yep, absolutely.
What was his faith at the time?
He was atheist. Yeah, he didn't have any faith at the time. Not Jewish, not one of the targeted religions. He begged for some food from this one particular Nazi who was overseeing a slaughterhouse in Minsk. And not only did this Nazi, who my dad called the giant because he was just so big, the giant give my father some food, but he gave my dad a job. So he employed my dad at the slaughterhouse, keeping the fires in the slaughterhouse lit. So my father learned to chop wood at the back of the slaughterhouse, bring it in and feed these fires to keep them lit. And that was his job suddenly amongst the Nazis for, I can't say for certain if it was for like 8 months or a year. He basically worked under the Nazis for the remainder of the time that they occupied Belarus. So to go back to your earlier question, my dad saw some stuff. He went through some incredibly traumatic stuff, which is why I say I understand why he may have drank.
I imagine he suffered physical, sexual, and mental abuse in his childhood, without a doubt.
Hypothesized that perhaps there was sexual abuse, which I never spoke to him about. I did 50 hours of interviews with my dad when I was about 21 years old, between the time I was 21 and 25. And I just never would have thought to ask if he had been sexually abused by any of these Nazis. But now at my age of almost 50, I have questioned whether that did happen. But in terms of mental and physical abuse outside of sexual physical abuse, I know that my father did endure that. The giant, as my father called him, he was replaced at the slaughterhouse by another Nazi named, as my father knew this one, Herr Krautzik. So Herr Krautzik actually made my father his courier and engaged him in going out into Minsk and collecting supplies for himself and for his troops at the slaughterhouse. He moved my father into his villa at the slaughterhouse. So that's one of the reasons why now, in my older age, I think this relationship is very strange. Why did this 40 to 50-year-old man move a 10, 12-year-old boy into his villa? And I just would never have thought to ask my father those questions during the interviews. But my father did detail the times that he did something that Herr Krautzik didn't like, and Herr Krautzik beat him, whipped him with his, swagger stick till my father was bleeding. There was always this psychological abuse that I come to term casual cruelty. Like, he could beat him in the afternoon, and then that evening they could be at dinner together in the villa, having a meal, pretending like the afternoon hadn't happened. So I have drawn the line between some of the violence in my own home and the need to just let it happen, not talk about it, and move on like it didn't happen.
Absolutely. That compartmentalization that people do is extraordinary.
Thank you for asking about my dad's history. I know it's a lot to digest.
No, I think it's such an important part of the conversation, and you can't really talk about your history without talking about his history.
Yeah.
When these countries were liberated, what happened to your dad next?
So towards the end of the Nazi occupation of Belarus, Herr Krautzik announced that he was retreating. They were going back to Germany, specifically to Hamburg, Germany. Krautzik said to my father, if you could get yourself to Hamburg, I will have a job waiting for you. You will have a place to stay. And my father saw the writing on the wall, saw that there was much more conflict now suddenly happening in Minsk as the forces were starting to push back into the city. And he had sort of had all that he wanted of that level of conflict. So he saw going to Hamburg as a way to avoid that. So he retreated to Hamburg as well. He hopped on a caravan of retreating Germans heading that way as well. This pretty much 2-week harrowing journey where they're driving from Minsk to Hamburg, just being bombed and shot at the whole way. My father had a letter from Krautzik saying who this boy is, help him get to Hamburg, to this address, signed by Krautzik, who detailed who he was in the letter. And as my father described, like this letter just kept getting him on the next truck to Hamburg. And he made his way to this bakery where there was a job waiting for him because Krautzik arranged for it.
That's incredible. Was your father encouraged to be a Hitler Youth, or was that not really thought of because he was just a worker bee?
Yeah, he never really spoke about being encouraged to be Hitler Youth. What he did for my father, though, was find ways to sort of justify the fact that they were keeping him alive because he was a Russian and he should have just been sort of killed, just like my grandma was. But they started to make a paper trail that made it okay for my father to still exist. I found records of a blood test that my father was given while he was still in Minsk living with the Germans. And the blood test says this person has German blood, which is absolute garbage, but it was a way to justify keeping him alive. And they started building him a new identity around this term called the Volksdeutsch, which was this idea that Hitler came up with in 1935, which were Germans who didn't have German citizenry, who were just kind of out in other parts of the world and no longer in Germany. So when my father got to Germany and to Hamburg and was working in this bakery, that's when this justification of my father as a Volksdeutsch really kicked into high gear. And he recalled for me working at the bakery one day, and suddenly these two Gestapo in their long coats with their swastika armbands showed up and brought my father to a doctor's office where the doctor measured my dad's skull size, gave him IQ tests, measured the distance, all those ridiculous eugenics-based garbage things to justify the fact that he was actually a Volksdeutsch, meaning he actually had German ancestry. He had just been, as that doctor said, been displaced into the backwards lands of Russia at some point. So really they were bringing him back into the folds and saying, actually, you're a German. which he absolutely was not.
I'm just, wrapping one's head. And I know this happens all over the world to this day. There are kids who go through this kind of thing truly everywhere in the world still to this day. It's mind boggling that we still haven't figured it out. That being said, it is, I don't want to use the word understandable because I do believe people have choices, but to endure the horrors of all of that and to come out unscathed would be astronomical.
Right. And it's so scary, as you spoke of, to imagine how many millions of kids this is happening to. Maybe not to the degree in terms of like the
magnitude,
the wild story that my father left with, but the displacement, the conflict that these millions and millions and millions of children are going through still, now in Iran, in Sudan, in Ukraine. It's mind-boggling. Yeah.
It's mind-boggling. What brings your father to the United States?
So when he was in Hamburg, he lived there through the end of the war. So again, he was surrounded by, although he went there to get away from the conflict followed him. And he spent a lot of those years from the time he was about 13 to 15 when the war ended, running from bombs, running from, air raids, running to bomb shelters. So, really building up that fight or flight response that I think we all inherited from him. At the end of the war, the UN came into Hamburg and was looking for displaced persons. And they found my father. The best way to get my father to do anything was to offer him food because he had grown up starving. So he loved his food. And 2 UN workers were sitting outside a building where they were looking for displaced people. And my father happened by them, and they offered him some food if he would sit and talk with them for a little bit. And those women figured out that my father was not a German, that he actually had gotten there from Belarus, and said, "Do you know you're a displaced person?" And he didn't know what that meant. And they explained that the UN was now trying to provide assistance to those who had been displaced from their home countries. And this was my father's escape from the Nazis. He, met these women on a Monday, talked to them, and was sort of declared a displaced person. And like the next day, he left his job that Krautsik had got him, didn't tell anybody where he was going, went back to the house with the women from the UN, and entered a UN displaced persons camp that next day. And he spent the next 4 years after the war in displaced persons camps in Germany, got an education through that program. He went to 2 years of engineering school. And at the end of that engineering program, he was like around 18 and was now this young, educated person. And the UN made him an offer to go. He could go back to Russia if he wanted to. He could go to England. He could go to the United States. And my father's philosophy mindset was that, the farther west he kept going, life kept getting better. So he was like, okay, I'm going to go as far as I can go, and I will go to the United States. So it was through the UN that he came to the States in 1949.
Incredible.
Yeah.
For someone who has been displaced of identity and self and needed to be so in order to survive, and then gets married, has children, has many children, 13 kids, it's hard to find one's own identity in the middle of 13 kids as well. But here you are, you're born, last child. And we haven't talked about your mom. I am interested about her story as well, especially because I imagine your father being quite broken in order to, and it was a different time. People got married out of utilitarian needs, not necessarily love, duty, honor, religion. There's all sorts of things back then that would bring people together. sometimes love.
Yeah.
But for somebody like you who's growing up in this house, you're the last child, all this other stuff is going on in the house. You have there's a disconnect of your heritage, a disconnect of who you are as well, because how
Yeah.
have like a proper understanding, especially if your father was pretty tight-lipped about it until you started interviewing him. How did you feel growing up in that, trying to find your own identity and figure out who you were as a person?
Yeah, I think there was a lot that I missed because of that displacement that my father experienced. We would have these glimpses of Russia, as I call Russia for myself, the motherland. Like when we would go, my father would take us to Boston to hear the the Red Army chorus. And we went maybe two or three times when I was a kid. And these were days where, my father would be sober. He would put on his nice shirt. My mom would put on her nice black skirt, and we would go to one of the theaters in Boston and hear this music and this language. And there was such a connection that I felt that I can remember seeing in my father as he listened just in that theater. It was almost felt like a bubble around me and my father and whatever siblings were there with us at that time listening to this music from the motherland. And it always drew me in. It always attracted me. It was like, I want to know more about this place that my dad came from that we don't speak about. My father doesn't speak his original language at home, but yet he has this, slight roll of his R when he speaks. So I was curious. And when I got to college is when it really started kicking in for me, my curiosity, and I started taking Russian language, politics, history courses, and then bringing some of that curiosity back home with me or to the phone calls that I'd have with my parents. The first call that I had with my dad from where I was in Ohio, calling him in Massachusetts and saying the most basic Russian phrase, like just, "Hi, how are you, Dad?" And just him laughing. And my mother would later say, like, welling up, like crying a bit about the fact that I was using this language with him over the phone. So it began this curiosity and this discovery for me of this land that my dad had been displaced from because of the war.
How was your father with you being gay? Was he okay with it, or did it cause an issue?
I think he never I came out, like I said, when I was 16, and he passed away when I was 25. So we had 9 years of him knowing who I actually was on that front. Um, and the first night that I told him, I told my mother at the same time when I think I was a junior in high school because I was deeply in love with my male friend and I just had to tell them. I just thought I have to tell them. We stayed up till like 2 a.m. talking about it, and we reached what I thought was an okay place about my identity. And then the next day I went to school and my friends still talk about this. Like I was so excited, like everything was great at home about my queerness, or as I identified it at that time, my gayness. And then when I got home from school that day, it just felt like somebody had died. Like the air in the house was just stale. My parents wouldn't make eye contact with me. And I left. I was like, I'm not spending the night in whatever this is. And I moved in with my friends for the next week, who I was already out to. I was already out to their parents. These parents of my friends gave me the love in that week that my parents were not able to show me. And when I went back at the end of the week to my home, it was to get more clothes. There was a slight shift in my mom. She was like beside herself that she hadn't seen me in a week. And I don't know where I got the courage to say it, but I was like, now you see what it's like to live without me. Do you want that? And she cried and said, no, I do not want that. And for my mother, that was the beginning of what I think was a 180 turn. around my sexuality. My dad quickly thereafter said he would support me in everything in my life except for this being that I was gay. But on the other hand, when I went to college, for example, my whole family came to the college graduation, and there was like a separate mini graduation for the queer kids called the Lavender graduation. And I gave a talk because I had done a research project about George Michael and George Michael's influence on queer lives. And my dad came to that ceremony, you know, walked in there, sat and listened to my talk, clapped when I got my little purple tassel. So we had ongoing conversations about it from the time I was 16 till I was 25. He never quite came around the way that my mom did. At one point, he said, I just don't want the world to not give you what I think you deserve. So there was this fear contained within his homophobia that I didn't have the language then to talk to him about the way that I would now. If I had him now, I would say like, but I am your queer kid, and having you against me doesn't help me with the rest of the world. Like, it would just be great if you also could support me and help me get through this world. So I never got to have that conversation with him, but I was never closeted with him again when there were instances where I would be talking about something queer, like some queer theory that I was learning about in school. He would kind of roll his eyes and be like, "Oh, you're still on that." And I'd be like, "I'm still on who I am and my people. Yes, I am. That's not going to change." So I never pretended or acted like who I was not who I was with him. And I never felt like it was impossible to have those conversations with him. He just never really budged in terms of acceptance.
I mean, I gotta say, you are, the stories you're telling me, you are extraordinary in your ability to be true to yourself in the face of all of this. It's an incredible quality. I hope you see that in yourself.
Thank you. I do, and I appreciate that. Not to put it all on my dad, but I see his resilience in me, in my siblings as well, and in my mom too. I think she was a very resilient person. But yeah, I do recognize that in myself, and I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, genetics, he went through a lot. Was your mom born in the States?
She was born in Chicago, which is where my dad immigrated to when he came here, and that's where they met. And if I may just give you the kind of her background, because I know you were interested, and it does tie into all of the alcoholism that we grew up around, because she grew up with an alcoholic father. I think was well trained, as Al-anon would later teach me, in caretaking for the alcoholic who was her father. She was kind of well prepped to do that when she met my father. And that was largely her role in the family, was keeping up this pretense of okayness while all of this nastiness is happening behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm. Is your mother passed away as well?
He did. So my dad passed away in 2002, and my mother passed away 10 years after him in 2012.
And what are their first names again?
Well, my dad had four because of his different identities, but his American name was Walter, and my mother's name was Beverly.
What were all of his names?
He was born Volodya. Herr Krautzik renamed him Wolfgang. And when he was in the UN camp, he happened to be placed in a UN camp that was populated almost entirely by Polish displaced people. So he learned his third language. He also adopted Catholicism when he was in the UN displaced persons camp. And he took the name Vladislav when he was christened, when he was christened. And then Walter is what they gave him when he came to the States.
I'm curious, did Herr Krautzik go to a tribunal?
I don't know. Yeah, the last time that my dad saw Herr Krautsick was in this time frame after the war ended, and they weren't quite sure what to do with my dad and other boys of his age. Because at that particular time, he was now in a training program run by BMW, learning how to take care of airplanes, which BMW had supplied the Nazis with all kinds of materials during the war.
Sure. Yeah.
And that program shut down after the war ended. And Herr Krautsick suddenly appeared at the factory where my dad was at that point, just like banging out dents in trucks and stuff because the program had really shut down. Herr Krautsick found him another job as an electrician's apprentice in Minsk until my dad connected with the UN. And I forgot your question. It was something about Krautsick.
I wondered if Krautsick had to go to tribunal. You may not know that.
Oh, I don't know. That was the last time. That's why I was bringing this up. That was the last time my dad saw him, was when he gave him this job as an apprentice, and my dad never saw him again after that.
There's such an irony to me about the fact that Herr Krautsick, a Nazi, and all the things that come with that, and yet if it weren't for him, you wouldn't even exist. And it's such a weird thing to wrap your head around, and it just goes to show you. I think we want to make our villains 100% full of villainy, and it's just not the case.
Yeah.
The more that we understand that humans have the capacity to be on both realms, in the goodness and in the evil all at once, until we understand that, I think we'll let the true evil pass by and maybe not even acknowledge true good, because there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, how I would probably express it is, the complicated story of Krautsick exists for my family. And like you said, there's a good chance my dad would have not have survived the war were it not for how Herr Krautsick gave him opportunities to survive. It's really interesting. When I initially conceived of War Boys when I was in college, I was telling this story to a professor, and it was because I wanted to, hopefully secure some funding to do some research for War Boys. And he jerked off the story and was like, I just don't imagine that the world is ready for a happy Nazi story. And I held those words for such a long time. I always thought, oh my God, am I writing a happy Nazi story? I showed the manuscript to my writing group, I don't know, 6 years ago. And I told them that story and that those words that I had been carrying of the world's not ready for a happy Nazi story. And my group member, Emily May, had just finished reading my manuscript and said, this is not a happy Nazi story. This is, if anything, it's the total opposite. Yes, your dad survives. Yes, Krautsick does things to help your dad, but he also beat your dad, and he also messed with your dad's head and laid out the groundwork for how your dad was as a dad. So there's nothing happy here. It's not like a redemption story for Krautsick.
No, and I think, again, this is what needs to be hammered into people, is the idea that a person has the capacity of pure evil as much as they have the capacity for pure good. And that the shades of gray that happen in that area is humongous. A person can be the most delightful, wonderful person in the world to one person and then turn around and murder another. It is fully the capability of every single human being, I believe. People, well, what about Gandhi? Well, Gandhi beat his wife, to keep her in line on the case. So there are, it just frustrates me, because I think that people get away with more because other people aren't able to see the capacity of evil in everyone as much as they can see the
complexity is what I was trying to get at in these stories that I tell. So I understand what you're getting at.
Yeah. So again, the bravery it would take for you to say to dad, I want to start interviewing you. That's a big deal in and of itself. That, to me, that says not only were you able to see your father as your dad, but you were also able to see him as a human and as a person who had a life that he lived and is complex and all that. And I think that is tricky for children to do of their parents. And again, it speaks to you and your ability to see that complexity. Tell me about that process, how you approached him, and then what began the next handful of years of you learning so much about him and how you felt during that process, because that's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's, you're talking about, seeing your dad. And I don't think I was seeing him at the beginning. I was just curious about these stories that I had heard little, bits of growing up. And when I got to college, I give a lot of credit to my Russian politics professor, Steve Crowley, who I'm very excited. I'll be in conversation with Steve for my book tour at a couple of locations. But he showed 21-year-old me and my class this movie called Come and See, which is a Russian film about the Nazi invasion of Belarus. And all of these moments in the movie of, bombed out buildings and bloodied citizens and death triggered something in my head. I was like, these remind me of stories that I heard my dad say that I wasn't really paying attention to from childhood. And I found myself, as I write in War Boys, it was like a magnetic pull to go talk to Steve and be like, oh, this movie makes me think of my dad. Like, it's just there's something that is the same. And I was babbling to him, and he was asking me questions about what happened to my dad's mom, what happened to the rest of his family, what happened to him after day one of the invasion. And I did not know the answers. My school has a month-long independent study opportunity called winter term, where January you can just do whatever research you want and hopefully find a professor to give you credit to do that. So Steve gave me credit for my first winter term to go to Florida, where my dad was for the winter, and start interviewing him. And I just did not at that time have the language or the understanding of what I was trying to do, which was trying to understand why this person was so awful to me and my family when I was a child, by asking questions about his life. I somehow internally knew there was some connective tissue. So I just started from the beginning with my dad. I went to Florida, put a handheld tape recorder between us, which I regret, and I would advise any oral historian get better equipment than I had at 21, because it's been very hard to listen to these tapes. But I said, start at the beginning. Tell me what your name was. Tell me where you were born. And it was like pulling teeth, I would say, for the first 2 weeks with my dad. He didn't understand why anybody would give me academic credit to talk about his life. He didn't want to answer questions. He just wanted to tell me what I now think of as the stories as he was comfortable telling the stories, as he'd grown comfortable telling the stories. And I just kept asking him pretty much the same question over and over again. How did that feel? How did that feel? How did it feel to come home and see that your building is bombed out? How did it feel to go back to the hilltop and all of your counselors are gone and you're alone? How did it feel to be hungry on the second and third day that you're in the city that you used to live in with your family, and now you're living in alone with these invaders all around? And he did his best to avoid me. I write in the book, he just blew off the question, got up, made a cup of coffee. You hear the clinking of his teaspoon in the teacup as he's just blowing me off, and tape's just rolling. And I just didn't go anywhere. I just stayed at the table, waiting for him to come back. Eventually he did, and he kept telling me stories. And the next day, I now had time to think about the stories from the day before, and he was ready to move forward and tell me more stories. And I said, wait, let's go back to, how that hunger felt on day 2. Tell me what you did with that hunger. What did you do to try and cure that hunger? And he hated that. Why do you keep asking me about the first days? He would say. And I said, because I don't know the whole picture yet. And I think I was already developing my sense as a storyteller of, context. I want context. I want more information to fill out the story. And it was within those first 2 weeks where I think we had some really big breakthroughs in the oral history journey, where one day at the end of a day of recording, and we would do about an hour of recording a day, I was sitting on the couch in their condo in Florida with my mom, my dad sitting behind us at a table, and we just hear him crying. And I turn and I'm like stunned that he's crying because it wasn't an everyday occurrence. And he said, "Don't you feel bad for me? Don't you?" Those words are locked in my brain. They're the words I conveyed in War Boys. And I walked up behind him and gave him a kiss on his head and said, "Of course I do, Papa. Of course I do." And I think that was the beginning of a shift for him in the work that we did together. There were other days where he did not want to do the work, but there were days where I think he succumbed to the idea that I was going to keep asking questions he didn't want to answer, and he would try to answer them. And another big moment also happened within that first 2 weeks where I was sleeping in the bedroom next to my parents. I had a terrible nightmare where in the nightmare, it was me running from a plane that was descending on me, and I was running from it, shooting at me. It woke me from my sleep. I stumbled out into the dark of the condo, and I found my dad out there in the living room as well, smoking his pipe, looking out the window at the moon that was over the pond behind their condo. And I told him about my nightmare, and he said he had had his own nightmare. And then he said, you damn kid, you're stirring it all up for me. And those two, I think, pivotal moments to our work together changed the dynamic of our work together, where suddenly he kind of clued into this is what this is going to be with my son doing this work. And I think some walls fell, and I just kind of got better material after that from him because he was a little more open.
I got to imagine for him that he kept that Pandora's box locked and sunk to the bottom of the ocean. And here you were, on the expedition to bring it up. And that must have been terrifying for him.
I think so. And I think terrifying for me. And I did not expect any of this. I did not know where the process was going to lead us. So yeah, I think, as I mentioned, I think he got used to telling the stories the way he felt comfortable telling the stories. And I was the disruption for that.
Youngest child disruptor.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not the first, and I certainly won't be the last. Yeah.
All right. So War Boys is the title of the book. And you completed it when?
Really, I completed it with copy editing like 2 weeks ago, but I worked on it I got my MFA in nonfiction writing starting in 2003, where I just started writing my dad's story. I kept writing it till 2009, where I got what I think was a terrible case of writer's block. And my joke that I always make is, like anybody with writer's block, I went to law school to combat the writer's block. So I went to law school and practiced law for 15 years and really came back to it in 2018, really finished what I think was a solid draft about a year ago and sold it about a year ago, and have been in the final revisions and copy editings since. But it'll be released on July 1st. So 27 years after I sat down to first interview my dad.
Did your dad get to read any of it?
No, he didn't. He passed in 2002. I started really writing it in 2003.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you, when he passed away, was it sudden or was it an illness that took him?
It was an illness that we never quite identified what it was. But when he passed, he had a cardiac event. But he had been sick probably for a year before that, losing weight, losing some memory, all sorts of things were going on with him.
Do you feel like you were able to have the catharsis with him before he passed for yourself?
I think we got fairly far along in our journey together. This feels slightly morbid to say, but I think my dad was in need of so much oxygen from every room that he entered that I feel like even when he passed away, the alcoholic system of my family just kind of fell apart. Like there was a lot of what do we do without this person? And I think there was so much growth for me and change personally that happened after he passed away. But I think he and I and our dynamic shifted greatly between 1999 when we started the interviews and 2002 when he passed away. And even in those years, 2000, 2001, there was just a lot of change and a lot more openness from my dad to just kind of being a person with me that I was so grateful that I had now, because he was no longer, everything wasn't pat and everything wasn't scrubbed and everything wasn't done in a way that maybe he felt was comfortable for me to experience. And I think I got to know him as a lot more complicated person, which was for me a very healing experience.
Your mom, having passed 10 years later, did she have a chance to read any of the excerpts?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, I think she did. Because as I mentioned, I really kind of put it away in 2009. But when I was getting my MFA, yeah, she came to my, graduation from there and heard me read some of War Boys, which was at that particular time just my dad's story, not my own story. And she was a big supporter and fan of the idea of my doing the work with my father. So I as I picked it up again in 2018, I looked through all of my archival material and I found all of these letters that are in my mother's handwriting, where she, after I started the interviews, just kept asking my dad for like names of people and like dates and places. And she would write them down and mail them to me at college. And I kind of didn't really think about them and I dismissed them until 2018 when I was pulling all this stuff out again. And I was like, this is my mom's work. Like, this is her hustle to make War Boys happen.
I love that. Tell people where they can find the book, where they can find you, and you're going to go on a book tour.
Yeah, I am. So, got my book right here. This is War Boys. This little guy on the cover is actually my dad when he's about 10 years old. And it's called the Father and Son Memoir. So it's his story as well as mine. It gets released by Trio House Press on July 1st. You can check it out at the Trio House website, buy it there, buy it on any site where books are sold, Bookshop, Powell's. And I love Powell's. You can also check out my website, warboysbook.com. You can order it from there and read some of the essays that I've written over the years that are related to War Boys and some not so War Boys related material as well. So be happy if people picked it up.
And what day do you launch your book tour? Same day?
Also on July 1st, I'm very fortunate to be involved with a writing center in Boston called Grub Street, and they are hosting my book launch. So my mentor, Alicia Abbott, will do an introduction, and I'll be in conversation with another memoirist named Teresa Okokin. And it'll be a party. All my friends are flying in from across the country to attend. So my husband will be there, and I will be there with bells on to launch War Boys into the world.
I love that. Jason, thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Please, everyone, get a copy of War Boys, and you will not be disappointed. It is a wild ride.
Good way to say it. Yeah. And thank you for the conversation. I, was listening to some of your podcasts before our time together and anticipating that it would be heartfelt conversation. And that's exactly what it's been. So thank you.
Thank you for that. And thank you for listening, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Rate, review, and subscribe to Hey Human Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks. Bye.